This is a good paper towel. Try to get a good lint-free one. You can actually use a rag if you wish, but I'm just going to take some of the pastel on the gritty surface and spread it. And you can see that you can get a really nice dusty appearance. You can spread that pigment into the surface and get this kind of dreamy, ethereal look. So really beautiful underpaintings could be created by just placing pastel and then spreading it around and letting the lightness of the paper work for you. We're not using anything wet, but we're getting a similar thing of color coming through in the surface. And we can again get that nice dreamy ethereal. I've done a lot of work this way. I know I have a reputation for this wet, slippy, slidey underpainting stuff, but this is still one of my old mainstays. And you don't need anything but your pastels to be able to do that. Don't put too much pastel on when you work in this method. Keep it thin. Apply a little bit of pastel. Go with stronger, clear colors and avoid a lot of pastel choices that have white or a lot of black already added to them, which is part of what we have in our pastel palette. Because when I spread it and I get some of that light paper coming through, if I have a lot of white in my pastel and it mixes together, it becomes cloudy and chalky looking. And that's something that all pastelists have resisted. We've had a hard enough time getting a reputation as serious, legitimate painters instead of just delicate pastelists. What we also don't want is that chalky look, that milk of magnesia look in our work. So avoid those tones that have a lot of white or a lot of black in them. Okay? Now let's just take some water and see what happens when I take those same pastels. Again, not very thick. I haven't filled the tooth of what's here, and I'm just going to use a brush that is actually an oil painter's brush. I prefer for this process, because the surfaces that I'm working on are textured, they tend to chew up delicate brushes. So even though I'm going to use water and watercolor here in just a minute, avoid watercolor brushes. They don't have enough body and strength for this process. And that can be one of the things that may be impeding what your underpainting can do for you. So this is oil painting brushes. Good bristles will work. But natural haired bristle brushes tend to break off and flake because they're real hair. These are synthetic. This is nylon-based brushes. Look for brushes that are sold as acrylic oil-based brushes, and those will work really well for you and stand up to the brutality of the sanded surface. So let's just wet the yellow right now, and you can see how beautifully the pastel picks up the water. And then I'll bring it right down into the red and pick the red up into it, very wet, a lot of fluid. And here I'm going to blot my brush a little bit so I don't completely dilute the blue as it migrates down. And just let these colors mingle here for a minute, play with a little bit of the water. And you can see that I get the appearance, basically, of watercolor. That what I'm doing is utilizing a light surface, just like a watercolorist does, to get transparency and translucency. And we're using our pastel. Pastel is pure pigment in a stick form. Watercolor is pure pigment with a little gum in it to hold it down onto its palette. But what are you doing? You're picking up this down here with a brush and water and applying it to the surface. And over there, we were using, here we got just a little resist on this surface. So I'm going to rub that just a little bit, get rid of that. There we go. So you can see that it mingles together, similar. Not trying to get exactly the same look. I haven't even chosen the same pigments necessarily, but I just want to show you that we can make pastel appear very similar to what watercolor can do for us on our surfaces, because it's really the water. When we talk about the mediums we're painting with, it's not so much that oil paint is different than watercolor in pigment or pastel in pigment. It's the vehicle that it's applied with. So pastel being pure pigment, when water is applied to it, it really in essence becomes watercolor. It's another method of watercolor. Here I'm choosing to just use watercolor. And since I really work a lot in plein air. I work a lot on location. It's a passion of mine, and it feeds my studio work for me, and I'll do it as long as I can and spend as much time out doing it as possible. To expedite the process, I really like having a small watercolor palette that I can quickly pop open, do a sketch on my surface, pop my palette open, and zip into a brush with water and put the pigment on, put that away, and go into my pastels. But I can get a very similar effect if I chose, very wisely, choosing pastels to place onto the surface and spread with water. It's just that this takes a little more time. So for the sake of economy and to expedite the process, I usually choose to use watercolor on location.